We tend to lift up our Unitarian and particularly our Universalist forebears as paragons of virtue. We praise their efforts to establish religious freedom, to abolish slavery, to secure the vote for women. And we see our work for freedom, equality, and justice as rooted in that legacy of respecting the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Well, when it comes to patting ourselves on our own backs, we need to be careful we don't strain something. People of any time in history were not only living and thinking in the context of that time, but they were human too. It's natural to want to think that there once existed some golden age when everyone was good and noble and virtuous, and if only we could fix certain current problems, then we could live once again in those good old days. But that's complete nonsense. Any golden age you choose to consider was only good for a privileged minority in society, whereas consideration of actual facts, rather than indulgence in wistful nostalgia, will clearly show that life on the whole gets better for more people as time progresses. So we have to be careful about how we regard our religious forebears. There were, for instance, Boston Unitarians who, for all that they preached freedom and reason and tolerance, nevertheless profited from the institution of slavery and opposed abolition. And on the Universalist side, one of the people who leaves me scratching my head is P.T. Barnum, who made his money by exploiting people and admitted to philanthropy only if it was profitable. And yet he was also an outspoken opponent of slavery and a major benefactor of Tufts University as a Universalist school. And then there's George Pullman. The Pullmans were Universalists in upstate New York, and George's father often led church services when no preacher was available. Born in 1831, George was the third of 10 children, and 2 of his brothers were prominent Universalist ministers. George, on the other hand, joined the family business, which included both cabinet making and moving buildings. Religious observance was important, though, and he had to write to his mother once he moved to Chicago to assure her that he was attending a Universalist church. Now, if the name Pullman is associated with railroad cars, here's why. Riding the newly built railroads and knowing something about the much more comfortable sleeping arrangements on canal boats from working near the Erie Canal, Pullman formed a partnership with a former state senator who owned the rights to railroad sleeping car construction, and he put some of his ideas into practice. After making his fortune in the Colorado Gold Rush, Pullman built increasingly lavish sleeping cars, promoting them through every means of advertising then available. Working with Andrew Carnegie and others, Pullman's business empire grew steadily bigger, and he became one of the wealthiest men in America. By this time married, the Pullmans attended a mix of Presbyterian, Universalist, and other churches. One of his biographers explains this. Having no real appreciation of the theological or practical aspects of religion, Pullman did not comprehend the differences between faiths. Based upon his childhood training and life experience, he considered participation in public worship a duty, but applied religious teaching solely to interpersonal ethics, not to social issues. Unfortunately, there were consequences of that lack of understanding. Since Labor Day is tomorrow, we're talking this morning about how it became a federal holiday in recognition of the rights and achievements of American workers only after an infamous railroad strike. And yes, Universalist George Pullman was the villain of this story. In 1880, George Pullman bought 4,000 acres of swampland south of Chicago, building there everything his company needed for industrial production, as well as housing for 10,000 workers. At first impression, it sounds quite sensible, even nice. Every home had indoor plumbing and gas lighting. The streets were paved and cleaned. There were pleasant parks, and workers could simply walk from their homes into the factories nearby. But Pullman freely admitted that he had little interest in aesthetics or actually improving people's lives. His workers living in a clean and pleasant town, he reasoned, would work better. And of course, he charged them rent for their homes. I have faith, he told the press, in the educational and refining influences of beautiful and harmonious surroundings. There was even a church, though since Pullman never understood how one faith differed from another, he built just one. That meant, because nobody from a different denomination could agree on how to share the one church building, it soon stood empty. The inhabitants of the company town, which of course Pullman humbly named after himself, had a rather different opinion of their conditions. As some of them declared, "We are born in a Pullman house, we are fed from the Pullman shops, we are taught in the Pullman school, we are given instruction in the Pullman religion, and when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell." I am sure many of them would agree with the line from 16 Tons that they owed their souls to the company store. And there was little option to change their working and living conditions, but to leave, if they could afford it, since Pullman prohibited independent newspapers, as well as public speeches, town hall meetings, and open discussions. Neither would he listen to any complaints or grievances from his workers, much less allow them to form a union. So when the stock market crashed in 1893, when the subsequent depression shut down much of the national railroad system, when Pullman cut his workers' wages without reducing their rent and other fees, well, the town of Pullman went on strike. What's more, 100,000 members of the American Railroad Union stopped operating Pullman's railroad cars. Pullman himself refused to negotiate. He refused the mayor of Chicago's request for arbitration. He refused the governor of Illinois' request to help former workers facing starvation. Instead, Pullman occupied himself in upstate New York by building a Universalist church in memory of his parents. It was lost on him that what had called his parents to Universalism in the first place was its simple message that God is love, compassion, charity. Now, during the previous decade, there had been a few different proposals for a holiday to celebrate the achievements of American workers. The idea of a Labor Day gathered steam during the 1880s, recognized first by cities and then by states, and there was certainly momentum to make it a federal holiday too. Following the May 1886 bombing of a labor demonstration at Haymarket Square in Chicago, though, President Grover Cleveland was concerned about choosing May 1st for Labor Day because of the date's connections to socialist movements. He preferred a date in September, which many trade unions were already holding celebrations then. This was unresolved until the Pullman strike. Specifically, in 1894, federal troops were sent into Chicago during the strike, triggering riots in which 6 workers were killed. In less than a week, Congress rushed to vote unanimously to make Labor Day a federal holiday, and President Cleveland signed it into law. And that may have been the very last time that the words "Congress rushed to vote unanimously" wherever applicable. Of course, just because there was now a federal holiday about celebrating the rights and achievements of American workers, that doesn't mean that everything instantly improved. You heard in our story how in the early 20th century, horrifying factory conditions and the deadly Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire spurred Frances Perkins to fight for labor protections, particularly for women, and an end to child labor. Perkins was Episcopalian, by the way. Even though she grew up in Massachusetts, she did not have any connection to either Unitarianism or Universalism that I can tell. We cannot claim Frances Perkins as one of ours. We have to claim George Pullman. And just a few decades later, it was the intersection of economic inequality with racial injustice that led Dr. King to expand the focus of his work to include the issues of militarism and poverty. This was after the victories of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and particularly the Voting Rights Act, and it cost him the support of many people, particularly white people, who had formerly called themselves his allies. Dr. King knew, though, that you can't just work on voting rights if you don't also work on housing rights and economic justice, and the ways that domestic and foreign policies help or hinder those causes. Genuine equality also means economic equality. So Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized the Poor People's Campaign, which was intended to tackle the social evils of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. One particular focus of that became the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. And in March 1968, Dr. King gave a speech to the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, a speech that unfortunately exists now only as a written transcript. Here are a few sentences from that speech. If you will judge anything here in this struggle, you are commanding that this city will respect the dignity of labor. So often we overlook the worth and significance of those who are not in professional jobs, not in the so-called big jobs. Let me say to you tonight that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, then it has dignity and it has worth. One day our society must come to see this. One day our society will come to respect the sanitation worker if it is to survive. For the person who picks up our garbage in the final analysis is as significant as the physician. For if he doesn't do his job, diseases are rampant. All labor has dignity. Dr. King's language of the dignity of labor and the worth of those who labor should resonate for us as Unitarian Universalists. For 40 years, the covenant that all UU congregations make with one another has included an affirmation and a commitment to promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The proposed new UUA covenant fleshes that out by its naming of equity, generosity, interdependence, transformation, and justice as UU values, all centered on love as the UU value. Both the old language and the new are for me direct consequences of that 19th century Universalist message, God is love, that George Pullman failed to understand and thus so completely failed to practice. I'm going to ask you some wondering questions now, and I'll give you a little time after each to reflect. Marcy will also put each question on the screen as I ask it. I wonder how you would describe the world of which we dream. I wonder which Unitarian or Universalist forebear you most admire. I wonder what you learned in the stories of George Pullman and Francis Perkins. I wonder how you experience the dignity of labor. What I hope you'll take away with you today are two lessons. First, if you're a parent, please teach your children what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. Joanne and our religious educators cannot do that in just 1 hour each week. The story of George Pullman should be a cautionary tale for all of us of the dangers of a superficial understanding of religion. Our covenants are not just pretty words posted on the wall. The words we read together are not merely poetry fulfilling our time. The hymns we sing together are not simply pleasant music. It all means something much more. I urge you to figure out what this faith means to you. That meaning will be unique to you, but the process of figuring it out is what we do together. So I encourage you to attend, for example, the Roots program I'm offering as part of Beloved Community Wednesdays on September 13th. I also urge you to help your children, if you have children, to figure out what Unitarian Universalism means to them. And since we are here in community, I urge you to help one another figure out what it means to each of us so that we can take this faith out beyond these walls and actually live it in the world. Second, please take time this Labor Day to think of all those whose work makes our lives possible. And not just possible, but for most of us, comfortable too. In our society, we really do, as Dr. King said nearly 50 years ago, tend to look down on those who are in so-called menial jobs, service jobs, low-paying jobs, as if the spiritual worth of a person could be determined by their education and their paycheck. And we should remember that just because someone doesn't have a job doesn't mean they don't work either. So take Labor Day as a reminder to show a little more kindness to the person behind the counter at the supermarket, to show a little more generosity, if you can, to the person who serves you at the restaurant. Take the opportunity to support workers at Amazon, Starbucks, and other places as they fight to unionize too. And if you work in one of those jobs that our society tends to demean and disparage, I hope you'll take a little more pride in knowing that what you do does matter, that all labor has dignity and all those who labor have worth. For whether you work in a professional job or not, whether you are paid fairly or underpaid or not paid at all or unemployed, you are entitled to dignity and respect too. May we always remember it to be so.